We will begin this story from the end. The last verse in Nehemiah 10 is a promise by the people: we will not neglect the house of our God. Welcome to another tidbit from the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. I'm Dr. Paul Peterson. Last time we looked at chapter 9, where we found a great prayer. The story continues. The two chapters are only divided because of length. We are in the middle of a narrative about a renewal of the covenant between those people who have arrived back from the exile in Babylon and who are now gathered on the 24th day of the 7th month. They are gathered in Jerusalem. They have celebrated the Feast of Tabernacles from day 15 to day 23. They have realized, studying the law, all that their people have done wrongs in the times past. Now they want to renew the covenant with God. They acknowledge Him as both righteous and gracious. And they acknowledge their own sins. They want now to be faithful. And this is more than just words. We're told in the last verse of chapter 9, depending on versification as translations or editions differ a little. I'm using here the English Standard Version today. Because of this, that's the history they have prayed about. Because of all this, we make a firm covenant in writing. On the sealed document are the names of our princes, our Levites, and our priests. And then you have some of these names. So this is a written document, which we assume would have been saved and preserved in the temple somewhere. And then you have the description of the promises, the obligations, and the covenant. From verse 28, the rest of the people, of the priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, the singers, the temple servants, all who have separated themselves from the peoples of the lands to the law of God, their wives, their sons, their daughters, that is, everyone, all who had knowledge and understanding, those who were mature enough to understand the reading. They enter into a curse and an oath to walk in God's law that was given by Moses, the servant of God. And this is a reference to the curse of the law back in Deuteronomy 28. In 28 to 30 in the chapters of Deuteronomy, you find the blessings and the curses. In Daniel's prayer in Daniel 9:11, you have the similar phrase used, the curse of the oath. That is, they acknowledge by this, it sounds sinister, but they acknowledge by this that God has been completely righteous in His dealings with the people. They had sinned, He has all right, and they now acknowledge this is still the case. So God, if we fail, then you are free to do as you want to. Now, then they move into the promises. And these promises we find described from verse 30. There are 6 of them, and half of them concern the temple institution, the priest, and the sacrificial system. But the first one, in verse 30, we will not give our daughters to the peoples of the land or take their daughters for our sons. Now, as you read the narrative in Ezra and Nehemiah, this is one of the issues that pop up. This command to completely separate yourself from other people, and especially in relation to marriage. In our modern Western culture, we may feel this is extremely harsh, but we have to understand this in light of the history of the people and in light of the social practice of the time. We want to think that all marriages are based on mutual love and voluntary decisions. That has not always been the case historically. When anyone in this time would enter into marriage, two families were combined. And when you marry with a pagan, your family will be integrated into a pagan system. You have to make clear lines of demarcation for the sake of your own identity as a people. The next promise has to do with the Sabbath. Now, at first, it is a promise not to do any trading with other people, so it's part of this separating and part of keeping a clear identity. But of course, in light of the prayer, which mentions the Sabbath twice, we should also understand this as part of being God's people, of the relationship with God. The third promise is expressed this way: we will forego the crops of the 7th year and the exaction of every debt. Now, the background is described previously in Nehemiah 5. So these promises are linked to the historical situation, and the background spoke about social injustice. So behind this promise to keep the law of the Sabbath year is a promise to take care of the poor, the exploited, the suffering. It's a promise of social justice. The last three promises are related to the temple service. That is an annual levy to the temple, bringing the first fruits of all crops, and bringing the tithe for the priests and the Levites. These are important rules of law, important to keep the temple and the temple service alive, important in order to keep the identity of the people still as God's people. So when you summarize these promises and remember that they were of particular importance in the context of the time and the stories we have in Esther and Nehemiah, you realize that it has first to do with keeping a clear identity as the people of God through avoiding intermarriage with pagans, which would have been like contracts with paganism, keeping the Sabbath, the great mark of identity, and then keeping the laws for social justice within the people, that is the mutual relationship within the people, and then keep the service of the temple, keep the priesthood alive and well. And that's the reason that the last sentence says, we will not neglect the house of our God. It is interesting that the verb that is here translated with neglect is the same Hebrew asab that has been used several times previously in the prayer in chapter 9, when it is said about God in verse 17 that you did not abandon us. Repeated later on in the prayer in verse 31 with the word forsake us. God did not forsake them. That is the same verb, asab. So because God had not forsaken the people, because he's a God of grace and mercy, they now will promise, we will not abandon you and your house, your service. So that is a good place to finish. We will not abandon God. Thank you for listening to yet another tidbit from the books of Ezra and Nehemiah.